Hello everyone, welcome to DM Tools with MaxMcCool. On today's episode of Monsters Manifested, we have finally made it past the A's and we're heading into the B's, starting off with the Banshee. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. So, the Banshee takes up all of page 23 in the Monster Manual, and its lore goes as follows. When night falls, unlucky travelers hear the faint cries of the forlorn dead. This woeful spirit is a banshee, a spiteful creature formed from the spirit of a female elf. Banshees appear as luminous, wispy forms that vaguely recall their mortal features. A banshee's face is wreathed in a wild tangle of hair, its body clad in wispy rags that flutter and stream around it. That's pretty interesting, actually. That's pretty cool. I didn't realize that banshees were specifically ghostly, ethereal forms of female elves. I figured it was just another type of generic ghostly undead type creature, but I could definitely work that into an adventure. Let's continue though. Divine Wrath. Banshees are the undead remnants of elves who, blessed with great beauty, fail to use their gift to bring joy to the world. Instead, they use their beauty to corrupt and control others. Elves afflicted by the Banshee's curse experience no gladness, feeling only distress in the presence of the living. As the curse takes its toll, their minds and bodies decay until death completes their transformation into undead monsters. Nice. So what you could do here actually is you could implement something with perhaps an encounter of a withering female elf, which would already in and of itself be curious, since elves are effectively immortal, right? And you approach this female elf who's kind of decaying and withering away before your very eyes. You know, it could be used as a bit of foreshadowing, or perhaps it could be used as a quest in and of itself, but we'll get into that later on. Moving on. Sorrowbound. A banshee becomes forever bound to the place of its demise, unable to venture more than 5 miles from there. It is forced to relive every moment of its life with perfect recall, yet always refuses to accept responsibility for its doom. Huh, that's cool. So they're stuck to the area in which they basically took their final breaths and cannot venture much further than that. 5 miles. I mean, a 5-mile radius is still pretty large swath of land to cover, but it makes for a nice area of environment and traversal and stuff for the adventurers to go through, definitely. Moving on. Beauty hoarders. The vanity that inspired the Banshee's cursed creation persists in undeath. These creatures covet beautiful objects, fine jewelry, paintings, statues, and other objects of art. At the same time, a banshee abhors any mirrored surface, for it can't bear to see the horror of its own existence. A single glimpse of itself is enough to send a banshee into a rage. Undead nature. A banshee does not require air, food, drink, or sleep. Alright, so we've got a pretty solid amount of lore for a banshee. The fact that they're vain, the fact that they're bound to a certain area where they took their final breaths and ended up passing on. They hoard pretty shiny things, great for treasure hoards or, rewards for your players, or even just a means of interacting and dealing with a banshee. Maybe if the optimal route is one of negotiation rather than of aggression, right? But let's move on to the stat block now. The banshee is a medium-sized undead with a chaotic evil alignment. It has an armor class of 12. It has an average of 58 hit points or 13 d8. Its speed is 0 walking speed and a flight speed of 40 feet in which it hovers. The Banshee has a strength of 1, a dexterity of 14, a constitution of 10, an intelligence of 12, a wisdom of 11, and a charisma of 17. Huh, that's cool. So, not particularly strong, not particularly wise or intelligent. Everything's pretty average across the board. I mean, except for strength, which is a 1, which I guess is understandable due to the fact that they're kind of disembodied, ethereal beings. But its charisma is a 17, which means it's probably got a couple of good ways of intimidating and persuading your players to do certain things, which makes sense due to their attraction, their physical beauty, I should say, that they had in their material lives, right? Now, moving on. The Banshee has saving throws of wisdom +2 and charisma +4. It has damage resistances of acid, fire, lightning, thunder, bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from non-magical weapons. Wow. So the Banshee is resistant to most things unless they are magical. It has damage immunities to cold, necrotic, and poison. It has condition immunities to being charmed, to exhaustion, to being frightened, to being grappled, to being paralyzed, to being petrified, to being poisoned, to being prone, and to being restrained. The Banshee has a sense of dark vision at 60 feet with a passive perception of 10. Languages a Banshee can speak are Common and Elvish, understandably. And the Banshee has a challenge rating of 4. So this creature is already kind of moving up a little bit in the CR scale for your players, which is good. It's actually a pretty interesting, could be a pretty cool boss if you wanted to do like a single big boss. Be a very interesting monster to use for your party, especially if you kind of long tail it a little bit with your players in the lower levels, once they pass level 3 and stuff like that. Anyway, moving on to the abilities. Detect life. The Banshee can magically sense the presence of living creatures up to 5 miles away. She knows the general direction they're in, but not their exact locations. Incorporeal movement. The Banshee can move through other creatures and objects as if they were difficult terrain. She takes an average of 5 or 1d10 force damage if she ends her turn inside an object. Now, onto the actions. Corrupting Touch. It's a melee spell attack with a +4 to hit, a reach of 5 feet on one target. On a hit, it deals an average of 12 or 3d6 +2 necrotic damage. Horrifying Visage. Each non-undead creature within 60 feet of the Banshee that can see her must succeed on a DC 13 Wisdom saving throw or be frightened for 1 minute. A frightened target can repeat the saving throw at the end of each of its turns, with disadvantage if the Banshee is within line of sight, ending the effect on itself on a success. If a target saving throw is successful, or the effect ends for it, the target is immune to the Banshee's horrifying visage for the next 24 hours. Finally, Wail. Can be done once per day. The Banshee releases a mournful wail, provided that she isn't in sunlight. This wail has no effect on constructs and undead. All other creatures within 30 feet of her that can hear her must make a DC 13 Constitution saving throw. On a failure, a creature drops to 0 hit points. On a success, a creature takes an average of 10 or 3d6 psychic damage. And that's all we've got for the stats and the stat block of the Banshee, which is pretty intense. I gotta admit, for a CR4 monster, the Banshee can mess up a party's day, really. That's especially if the dice are against them that day. Now, let's move on to some adventure crafting, shall we? So, initially for me, the Banshee, the first thing that came to mind, I would say, is something to the effect of perhaps like an adventure that is long-tailed a little bit, where, now, I mean, you could incorporate this adventure into an area like the Feywild and stuff like that, but you could do it on the material plane as well. And I think the material plane would probably be a good implementation of it for low-level characters. If you're a new DM and you're just kind of looking for means to start a game up with your friends real quick, the material plane is probably a good place to start, just because you don't have to worry yourself so much about the strangeness and oddness of different planes of existence, right? Like the Shadowfell or the Feywild and stuff of that nature. But either way, I think that this creature, that the Banshee, can be used in a very cool way, where effectively the way I would run this is I would start out with my characters or my players, maybe once they got to level 2, maybe even level 3, either way, before they were at the appropriate level to go up against the Banshee, I would initiate something a bit more long tail to where they encounter an elven woman who is, maybe she's hidden out in a swamp somewhere, almost like you would think a hag would be or a witch, but she's not necessarily a hag or a witch. Maybe she's just isolated herself, or she has been exiled from whatever kingdom or town or city that she originally lived in due to her lack of, what would I call it, ethical conscientiousness. And when the players approach her and encounter her, they see that she is remarkably aged and kind of thin. Maybe she's a little sallow, and perhaps she's very thin or frail looking with grayed hair and stuff of that nature, which would immediately be odd to any individual that would know a little bit about elven biology, I guess you would call it. Or if you had an elf character in your party, that would be a perfect opportunity to provide them with a little bit of information as to the effect of, like, elves don't typically age this drastically throughout their lives since they live effectively forever. And an elf that appears this way would have to be very, very, very old, or perhaps there's a curse on them or something like that, because this is not typical of elven individuals, right? So I would do something to that effect. Now, how would the adventurers encounter the elven woman? I think the encounter for the elven woman could be, it could be an offshoot thing, like on their way between one town to the next, or maybe in the middle of another adventure that they're currently on. It could be like a happenstance thing, like a random occurrence type thing, where they just stumble upon her house or her hut or something like that. Or you could implement a system where the players effectively get to a town or are in a village or something of that nature, and perhaps the citizens of the town or village or city pay tribute to this elven woman. Perhaps she's a highly regarded individual. Perhaps she's a shaman of some sort, or perhaps she's the individual that owns the land that the town or the city or the village is built upon. And so tribute is provided to her, right? And in that way, you could actually implement a bit of history in the building up of her vanity or her materialism, if you would. So the players could encounter her that way, and perhaps she sends them. That would be pretty cool, actually, if she was the quest giver. If she sends them on a quest to find some form of worthy tribute, perhaps she's gotten bored of the decorative celebratory daggers and shields and armors and helmets and boots and capes and rugs and carpets and all of those gifts that have been given to her. Perhaps none of that's enough anymore for her. It's become very bog standard in her eyes, right? Nothing super shiny. So perhaps she knows of a place where there might be a couple of beautiful objects that are more interesting to her, or more appealing rather to her, because they are different from the typical tribute or gifts that she gets. So you would have your adventurers interact with her, and once they acquire the quest, then they're sent off, or they're on the road to seek out these objects, right? Now, at the end of the day, this elven woman, if they're already vain and materialistic and are using their beauty and other means to corrupt and control others, which would be another great way of reasoning why the townsfolk or anything like that provide her with tribute, because she's corrupted them all with her otherworldly beauty and attraction. She could just lie to the party and say that perhaps she'll reward them with something spectacular or special, or perhaps just the attraction of treasure would be enough to present them with the motivation to venture forth for her, right? And to acquire certain things. Something to the effect of, I've heard of this ruined area. Perhaps she knows of the ruined area, right? She is an elf, so perhaps there used to be a fort or some form of perhaps another town or city that now lays in ruins, but she knows that within, the subterranean chambers of certain places within those ruins there are beautiful pieces of jewelry or objects or weapons or armor, and she essentially informs the players of all of this and states to them, like, whatever you can carry, you can take, but I would like one thing that you would see as more than just beautiful. I would like one of these objects from each of you as tribute type thing, right? Now, in this instance, what you could do is you could then move your players along. Perhaps the area is not necessarily close. It's not necessarily just down the way. In this instance, in this case, I wouldn't make it an immediate adventure, right? There's not a sense of urgency to this adventure. It's if you can go to this place that is across the continent or up in the mountain ranges, maybe it's an old dwarven kingdom that's fallen into ruin and hasn't been inhabited for however long, right? But right now the players are at perhaps some coastal area, so they'd have to move inland and perhaps northward or westward, or however you have your world kind of built out in your mind. So it would be a long distance trek for them to acquire something for her. And you could pepper in a few other adventures on the way to that place. And as the players make their way along, they level up, they rest, they interact, they go to different towns, different trade routes, they encounter different groups, different people, different towns or cities or kingdoms, different environments, all sorts of things. And once they finally get there to that place, you would have them go through these ruins. Let's go with the Dwarven Ruin because that was what I first brought up. So with the Dwarven Ruin, you could do something where the players make their way in. It's mountainous and stuff, so that in and of itself is a pretty interesting undertaking, right? Perhaps they have to climb the mountain some way. Perhaps they can take a safer route to climb up the mountain, but it'll take longer to get there to the ruins. And there's more opportunity for random encounters with beasties of any sort. I mean, you could implement what we did all the way back in the first episode, if you'd like, with the Arakocra, and perhaps the Arakocra fly around and guard this mountainous area due to the fact that there's a portal at the top of the mountain that leads to the elemental plane of air. You could use things like the Ankh Egg that we used earlier in a couple episodes, or a couple of episodes ago, that comes out of the ground and ambushes them. There's a lot of ways, or you could use any other creature that you have in mind that you feel would appeal to the group, right? You could use brigands or bandits, that are on this trail because it's a good trade route. A lot of traffic kind of goes through there. And so there's a good ambush spot that they can jump in and rob people on wagons and carts for their stuff. Maybe there's a small tribe or a small village of goblins or orcs that kind of reside in the lowlands, at the base of the mountain, something like that. Or you could do something that's a little more interactional or social, rather, that perhaps requires some form of negotiation. Perhaps the pathway into the mountain is blocked off by some tribe or village or small area, small town, a gathering of people, right? And maybe they have to negotiate means to get to the mountain itself, right? Perhaps there's another quest laid in there of, if you can get to the mountains, perhaps you can collect something for us, or perhaps you can tell us, scout for us these mountains and stuff and let us know of what resides there and all of that stuff. But either way, so the adventurers make their way to these dwarven ruins, and they go through the dwarven ruins. They progress, they have a few encounters, perhaps with monsters, perhaps with traps. Perhaps there's a small number of dwarves that still reside in there, they manage to survive somehow. Perhaps the inside of the ruins is inhabited by those brigands or bandits that we mentioned earlier that try to ambush people on the roads and stuff to that nature. Perhaps the ruins are just covered in undead, right? Perhaps they're just swarmed with like zombies and skeletons and stuff of that nature, which is totally usable, but also a nice means of foreshadowing, I suppose. Or not that it would be a blatant revelation, but in the way that the players could be like, oh, that's interesting but typical. Old ruins have undead in them. That's fine. But they wouldn't necessarily expect to return to somewhere that is now also going to become an encounter with an undead being, right? But moving on. The players will eventually make their way through these ruins. They'll collect whatever shinies that they want to collect, and they'll eventually make their way back to the town or kingdom or swamp or village or wherever it is that this female withered elven individual resides, and told them to return, and will return there with their tribute in hand for her. Now, the thing is that it's a little tough to convince your players to go on a quest and adventure for an individual who they're not typically fond of, who they're not necessarily fond of, which is fair. Nobody really wants to work with or work for another person that they don't like being around, or they don't like typically. But there are a lot of cases or instances where people are forced to, right? Or they will choose to because it is beneficial to them in some way. So I do think that as a DM, you would have to push a bit more of the incentive in basically like what your players are going to receive for doing this quest, right? Now, it could be something like a magical item within the treasure. It could be something like clearing out the ruins will assist the folks at the base of the mountain that we mentioned before. It could be straight up manipulation, right? It could be that this soon-to-be Banshee just lied to them and just said, hey, go get these things for me. Yeah, there's definitely a magical something there. There's a scroll of wish, that you can use, and you can change reality and all of that stuff, when in fact there really isn't anything, which could work out to your benefit anyway, because now your players will want to go back with a vengeance to confront the elven woman who deceived them, right? So there's a couple of avenues you can take to incentivize them to go out in the first place and collect these items for the Banshee, and to have them return to her with these things, because they might just decide, hey, we've got all the shinies, like we don't have to go bring it back. So you could use something like that, like something deceptive, which will give them a bit of reasoning to go back in the way of justice. You can have something to the effect of an offering that perhaps is just too good to turn up. Perhaps the soon-to-be Banshee will offer them a scroll of wish spell or of something else, right? Or maybe they would do it because she's basically the individual that the commoners of the area are forced to sacrifice and worship and provide tribute to, and she doesn't really necessarily deserve it, or she's, at the very least, she's ungrateful about it and she doesn't really care, and feels entitled to all of that stuff. You see what I'm saying? But you could go around that in any way, right? However, let's continue forward. I'm rambling again. So the players will make their way back to this town. And a 5-mile radius is pretty big for a Banshee. So what I would do is I would then, once the players kind of get within that range, I would start creating or implementing instances, perhaps at night when they're camping out to rest or something like that. You wouldn't necessarily have a combat encounter with the Banshee right then and there, but maybe you would have something to the effect of a ghostly presence is seen if whoever's on watch makes a successful perception check, you know what I mean? And they see this eerie, ghostly figure kind of appear behind maybe a set of trees, or maybe if they're on the plains or something like that, they see in the distance just kind of oddly standing out there with a strange gray-green glow. They see this incorporeal thing that billows in the darkness and is oddly illuminated, even though it's the middle of the night, right? And they blink and it disappears, right? And you can then pepper in aspects of the Banshee as they're making their way back, right? You don't want to necessarily swamp your players with all of these hints, but peppered in here and there as they make their way back. Again, 5 miles is a pretty long distance to traverse on foot. Even on horseback, it's still pretty far. And perhaps on that same night, after the incorporeal being vanishes, right after the person on watch blinks and that incorporeal being is gone, perhaps they swap out and another person is on watch. Perhaps the party is awoken just before dawn to the sound of this horrifying, bone-chilling wail out in the distance, right? And they wake up just before sunrise, and they're unsure of what that is, of what happened there, of what's going on. But, as they continue further through back to where the aged, withered elven woman is maybe they stumble upon a scene of perhaps some corpses, perhaps a corpse of a merchant and their horses with just the wagon kind of left there on the side of the road, with the campfire still warm and stuff to that effect. Perhaps there's something to the effect of creatures like animals. Maybe there's like wolves or bears or bugbears. Maybe there's goblins or orcs or something like that, right? And it's just kind of an area of death, right? But with no means of being able to understand the crime scene, if you would, right? There's no cuts, there's no blood, there's no damaged anything, there's no, there's no scrapes or scratches on the body, there's no signs of combat in the earth, if there's trees around, there's no like carvings in the bark of the trees and stuff like that. I mean, you can show that if you're using humanoids, you can show that the individuals weren't even armed necessarily. Like they had their weapons about them if they were, let's say, brigands or a security detail for a merchant or something of that nature. And they had their weapons on them, but they are sheathed. They weren't prepared for combat when they fell, which would, again, lead to some very interesting situations for your players, I think, right? Now, if you wanted to do something else to that effect, you could do something to the effect of like, perhaps one of the individuals in that group managed to survive, and perhaps they're sitting with their back up against a tree, just kind of blubbering into their hands, and they can explain that this strange incorporeal thing that appeared, let out this like baleful moan and killed off everybody except them. You could also have that individual be just too afraid to even talk, right? Like everything terrifies them now because they saw this strange ghostly creature, and just by letting out a wail, it murdered everybody that they know except them. So now, and they've been so traumatized that they're incapable of communicating anything, right? In which you could then implement a thing where one of the players, maybe the one that was taking watch, that spotted the Banshee way in the distance, could say, oh, well, I saw this thing too. I wonder what it is. And it might lead to your players then having even more drive to make their way back to that elven woman to tell her like, hey, so that there's these weird ghostly things that are terrorizing the people on the roads and your townsfolk and that kind of stuff. It would further incentivize them to make their way back to her. So the players will then make their way back to the dwelling of this elven woman. And perhaps once they appear, or once they arrive, they get there and they see that this elven woman is no longer amongst the living. In which case, you can then drop the Banshee on them. Maybe the Banshee appears behind them and a combat ensues, right? Perhaps the Banshee appears just before they make their way to the dwelling of the elven woman in an effort to protect basically the immediate area where she lays, right? Where her body lays. And you can have a bit more of an open fight there, right? And I mean, there's a lot of ways you can play the Banshee in a combat scenario. You could play her very, very deadly, which I think if the encounter on the way back with the dead masses of individuals or dead creatures wasn't enough to kind of telegraph to them that this character or this monster can do some serious damage in an unknown way, you could pull your punches a bit, but I would recommend just using it. I mean, the Banshee can only use it once a day anyway, right? So I would recommend just using it. Chances are more of your players will succeed than fail. I mean, the saving throw is only a 13, so maybe something like the spellcaster will fall to it, or maybe the healer, if your healer doesn't have a lot of constitution, which could prove to make things pretty sticky. But that's why we do this as DMs, right? There needs to be true danger and consequence, and players can't just run in all the time and unthinkingly destroy and kill everything in their sights, right? Especially when you have a character like a Banshee that can fly through objects and can move about and stuff like that. It's a very good way of getting your players to think and strategize, I would say. It's a good monster to use for that, to strategize a way to overcome this threat, right? And I mean, Banshee does not have the most health, and its AC is only 12, so It's not as though it's super tough to hit. It's not as though it's a meat shield. So they could do away with it pretty well. The thing it does have that makes things a little bit trickier is all of those resistances. It's basically resistant to everything except for magical weapons, right? So what I would do is probably in one of those adventures on the way to the place to acquire the tribute for the Elven Woman, or in the ruins themselves where they do acquire said tribute, I would probably populate the treasure hoard in there, or whatever is there, with a couple of magic items. Not anything too crazy strong necessarily, not necessarily something that can just demolish this creature, but a magical sword, maybe a magical quiver where arrows that are placed in the quiver are considered to be magical in some way. Perhaps a ring that allows for some form of enhancement or something like that, right? Just so that at least one or two of the players, depending on the size of your party, of course, one or two of the players can manage to damage the Banshee for actual damage instead of half damage, right? I mean, the Banshee is, like I said, resistant to pretty much everything. It's immune to a couple of things. It's immune to quite a bit, actually, in the way of damage and condition, right? It's immune to cold, necrotic, poison. It's immune to being charmed, being exhausted, and being frightened, and grappled, and paralyzed, and petrified, and poisoned, and proned, and restrained. So there's not really much in the way of options, right? Which is kind of good because it'll also kind of force your players to be a bit more creative, right, on their feet, which could turn out pretty nicely. And again, with the horrifying visage, you can use that as well. That would basically make your players, or any players who failed the wisdom save, the DC 13 wisdom save, it would apply the frightened condition on them for a minute, which is effectively 10 turns, and they can repeat the saving throw at the end of every turn, and then with disadvantage if the Banshee is within line of sight. And if it succeeds, then it's immune to the horrifying visage for next 24 hours, right? So that's a good way of going about it, and using the frightened effect with the horrifying visage to inform the players of why perhaps the sole survivor of the group of corpses, or the crime scene, let's call it, that they saw on their way back was so afraid that they couldn't even communicate anything, right? And then once the combat is over and the Banshee has been defeated, the players have free reign of her dwelling to the treasures and all of that stuff that she's collected in her material form. And maybe there's some other magic stuff in there. Maybe there's a little something in there that incentivizes them to move on to their next quest or their next adventure, right? Perhaps there's a note or a letter that requests some form of audience with someone, or a request for a certain item or something like that. And on top of that, if you use something like a village or a town or a city even, then what ends up happening is if they overcome the Banshee, you then have a whole community that is grateful of the players, the characters, for overcoming this. I mean, they had an individual that they were forced to pay tribute to, regardless of whatever they were going through in their own lives, and it was never good enough for the individual. Then the individual passed because of their own corruption, and now the town or neighborhood, or in the 5 miles around that central point, basically, were being accosted by the incorporeal corrupted form of this person, right? So I think they would be pretty relieved to be free of that kind of shackle, and they could offer, they could offer free food and board, perhaps a discount on prices at the blacksmith, or anything like that. Perhaps they're given a free passage through there at any time, free anything, really. Perhaps they are given first dibs on bounties, or perhaps they're free to use the barracks of the town guard that is around them, or perhaps they're free to repair their items and armor and all of that kind of stuff whenever they pass through. Stuff like that. And then you could then use a couple of those things to move the adventurers forward onto their next quest. But that's all I've got for you folks when it comes to the Banshee, and ways that you could use the Banshee in an encounter and stuff of that nature. And it's a pretty cool monster, I must admit. It's pretty cool. It's different. It's not your typical undead in the way of like just a zombie or a skeleton, which we'll get into adventures using them once we finally hit S and Z respectively. But the Banshee is worth giving a shot, I think. There's a lot of cool ways that you can go through and flesh out an adventure using a Banshee as the main monster, if you would. The way that I've just presented it was just the first thing that popped into my head, and I think that it could be pretty cool if you kind of long game this particular monster, and it'd make for a pretty interesting reveal, with some conversational stuff, when not sitting at the game table while not in game. I think it'll make for something that's not necessarily crazy impactful and, oh my God, that's unthinkable type things, but it'd be a nice turn of events that would stick in your players' minds for a little bit, right? And that's kind of what we want, we want to have lasting effects on our players in a good way. Either way, our next episode of Monsters Manifested will be covering the Basilisk, a very interesting creature, a very cool monster that I've used a couple of times in my adventures. So I'll see if I can come up with something neat for you guys the next time we meet. But for now, thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll see you all on the next one. Have a good day, everyone.